A Korean mafia boss pays a homeless woman $1 million to have his baby, but when the child was born, he broke down and could not stop crying. Before we begin the story, comment below with the city you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Sung-jae Park was a 33-year-old man who controlled one of South Korea's most feared crime syndicates. Money, power, blood, he had it all. But that night, staring out at the Seoul skyline from his penthouse, he realized something terrifying. Despite everything he'd built through violence, there was one thing he couldn't take by force. An heir. His aging father had given him an ultimatum: produce a bloodline successor within a year, or the entire empire passes to his cousin. Sung-jae needed a child, but he didn't want the complications of a wife or a relationship. Love had failed him twice already. One woman fled after witnessing what he really was. Another miscarried from the sheer terror of living in his world. He was done with emotions. Done with weakness. A child wasn't about love, it was about legacy, about survival in a world where family bloodline meant everything. And Sung-jae Park always got what he wanted. He just needed to find the right woman. Someone with nothing to lose. Someone desperate enough to take his deal and disappear forever. Before we continue with what happens next, I need to be honest with you. Over 90% of you are watching these stories without subscribing, and that actually hurts the channel more than you realize. Every view without a subscription tells YouTube this content isn't worth recommending to others who need these stories just like you did. If this story grabbed your attention in the first minute, if you're curious about what happens when Sung-jae meets Martha and why he breaks down at the birth, then please, hit that subscribe button right now. It takes 2 seconds, costs you nothing, but it means everything to keeping these stories coming. Don't be part of the 90% who takes without giving back. Subscribe now, then tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and let's continue with Martha's story. The call came at 3 in the morning, which meant it was serious. Sung-jae's father never contacted him at civilized hours. Old men who'd built empires from blood and bullets didn't believe in convenience, only in reminders of power. The estate. Tomorrow morning. 8 sharp. No pleasantries. No explanation. Just the dial tone that followed every conversation with Park Jin-ho, the man who'd turned a small gambling operation in Busan into South Korea's most formidable underground network. Sung-jae stood on the balcony of his penthouse, Seoul sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he'd inherited through birthright and brutality. 20 years of proving himself, of making the hard calls his father's generation couldn't stomach in the new world. He'd modernized their operations, legitimized 70% of their holdings, and made the Park name synonymous with power in both the shadows and the boardrooms. But as his Maybach wound through the gates of the family estate the next morning, past cherry trees his grandfather had planted with hands that had strangled 3 rival bosses, Sung-jae felt something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. His father waited in the study where every major family decision had been made for 50 years. Park Jin-ho looked smaller than Sung-jae remembered, his 78 years finally showing in the way he gripped his cane. But his eyes, those eyes still held the steel that had built everything Sung-jae now controlled. "You're 38, his father said without preamble, not bothering with the tea ceremony or the formalities that usually preceded family business. "Your cousin Dong-wook is 42 with 3 sons. Your uncle Jae-sung reminds me of this every time we meet." Sung-jae's jaw tightened. Dong-wook, his father's brother's son, the one who'd never had the stomach for the real work but had been smart enough to marry young and produce heirs like it was a competitive sport. "I've been building what you started," Sung-jae said carefully. "The hotel chain is legitimate now. The construction contracts are all above board. We've got prosecutors and politicians who owe us favors, not fear. That's worth more than my legacy dying with you." His father's cane struck the floor. "I don't care about hotels, Sung-jae. I care about blood. The Park blood that built this family when we had nothing but fists and ambition." The old man moved to the window overlooking the estate grounds, where Sung-jae had learned to fight, to negotiate, to understand that power without succession was just borrowed time. "Your mother and I, we gave you everything. We protected you from the dirty work until you were old enough to choose it yourself. We let you go to university in America, get your MBA, come back and play businessman." Jin-ho's voice softened, which somehow made it more dangerous. But the one thing we needed from you, the one thing that matters, you've failed to provide. I've been focused on. On what? On building an empire you'll leave to strangers? To lawyers and board members. His father turned, and Sung-jae saw something he'd never seen before, fear. Not of rivals or prosecution, but of irrelevance. Of ending. I'm giving you 1 year, Jin-ho said. 12 months to find a suitable woman, marry her, and get her pregnant. I don't care who she is, find someone from a good family, someone young enough to give us multiple heirs. Handle it like you handle business negotiations. Be strategic. Be efficient. And if I don't? Sung-jae knew the answer but needed to hear it said. Then the organization passes to Dongwook when I die. The hotels, the construction companies, the real estate holdings, everything legitimate goes to you. But the family business, the network, the real power. His father's smile was cold. That requires blood that continues. Dongwook's sons are 12, 14, and 16. Old enough to learn. Young enough to be shaped. The study felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the weight of 3 generations of Park family history. Sung-jae thought of his cousin, weak-willed, dependent on his wife's family money, a man who'd never made a hard decision in his life. You'd give everything we've built to him? I'd give it to his sons, his father corrected. Because they carry our name forward. You think I want to? You're my son, Sung-jae. My blood. But I'm dying. The words hung in the air like smoke. The doctors give me 3, maybe 4 years. And I won't die knowing the Park legacy dies with me because you were too busy playing corporate titan to remember what really matters. Sung-jae left the estate an hour later with his father's ultimatum ringing in his ears. 1 year. 12 months to do what he'd avoided his entire adult life. Tie himself to someone, create the vulnerability of family, produce an heir who could be used against him by enemies he'd spent 2 decades collecting. As Seoul's skyline appeared through the morning haze, Sung-jae realized something that settled in his chest like ice. His empire meant nothing without someone to inherit it. All his power, all his careful planning, all the blood and calculated risks, worthless if the Park name ended with him. He had 1 year to secure his legacy. Time to get to work. The Los Angeles deal should have been simple. 15 modified rifles, untraceable serial numbers, cash exchange in a parking garage downtown. Sung-jae handled it the way he handled everything, with cold precision and zero conversation beyond what was necessary. The buyer never saw his face clearly. Nobody ever did. He returned to his hotel at 2:47 a.m., bone-tired but too wired to sleep. The adrenaline from these transactions always lingered, made his pulse hammer for hours afterward. He took the service entrance around back, preferring the shadows to the lobby's fluorescent exposure, and that's when he saw her. A woman, curled against the dumpster like she was trying to become part of the brick wall. Brown hair matted, clothes that might have been donated 3 owners ago, 1 shoe missing. She wasn't passed out, he could see her eyes open, staring at nothing, that particular kind of awake that comes from having nowhere safe to sleep. Sung-jae should have kept walking. He'd seen 1,000 people like her, past them without a second glance because getting involved meant complications, and complications meant vulnerabilities. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the methodical way she was organizing the contents of a torn plastic bag beside her. 3 cans of food. A blanket with holes. A water bottle she'd refilled somewhere. The desperate logic of someone still trying to maintain order in chaos. You hungry? The words left his mouth before he decided to speak. She looked up, and for the first time he saw her face clearly. Mid-30s maybe, or younger and aged by circumstance. Eyes that assessed him with the wariness of someone who'd learned every kindness had a price. What do you want? To buy you coffee. He nodded toward the 24-hour diner visible at the corner, its neon sign buzzing in the dark. That's all. Nobody does nothing for free. I'm aware. Sung-jae pulled out his wallet, extracted $200 bills, held them where she could see. Coffee and conversation. You can leave whenever you want. Keep the money either way. She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her calculating risks, weighing hunger against danger. Finally, she gathered her belongings, every single item, trusting nothing to stay unguarded, and stood. "If you try anything, I won't." He meant it. Whatever this was, it wasn't that. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and sanitizer. They took a booth in the back, and Sung-jae watched as she ordered like someone who hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Pancakes, eggs, bacon, hash browns, orange juice, coffee. When the food came, she ate with mechanical efficiency, not savoring, just consuming necessary fuel. "What's your name?" he asked when she'd slowed down enough to breathe. "Martha." She didn't ask his. Smart. "How long have you been on the street?" 8 months. "Since my landlord doubled the rent and I couldn't keep up." She said it matter-of-factly, no self-pity, just reporting circumstances. "Lost my job when I lost my apartment. Can't get hired without an address. Can't get an address without money. You know how it works." He did. The mathematics of poverty were elegant in their cruelty. Any family had a sister. She died 3 years ago. No parents, no kids, no husband. Martha looked at him directly. "Nobody who'd miss me if I disappeared. That's what you're getting at, right? This is the part where you tell me what you actually want." Sung-jae felt something shift, that sensation of a door opening onto a path he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. "I need a surrogate. Someone willing to carry a pregnancy to term, deliver the baby, then walk away. Permanently. No contact, no parental rights, no connection whatsoever." He expected shock, outrage, questions. Instead, Martha just stared at him, her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. "How much?" $1 million. Half upfront, half upon delivery. She set the cup down carefully. "And I'd have to do what, exactly?" "Live in a secure location. Receive medical care. Deliver a healthy baby. Then disappear." Sung-jae leaned forward. "You'd sign contracts. Ironclad NDAs. Legal documents ensuring you have zero claim to the child, zero ability to ever make contact. You'd essentially cease to exist as far as that baby is concerned." "Why me?" Martha's voice was steady, but he could see her hands shaking slightly. "You could hire a professional surrogate through proper channels. Because those channels require records, questions, legal frameworks I can't afford. I need someone with no connections, no paper trail, no one who'd come looking." He paused. "I need a ghost." The diner hummed around them, insulated from the sleeping city beyond its windows. Martha looked down at her empty plate, at the life she'd been scraping together from nothing, at the impossibility of escape. When she looked up again, her eyes were clear. When would this start? The private jet touched down at Incheon International Airport just after midnight, and Martha pressed her face against the window, watching the runway lights blur past like fallen stars. Somewhere below, her mother was sleeping in that cramped hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed through the night. The memory felt impossibly distant now, separated by 7,000 miles and a contract that had bound her tighter than any chains. A black Mercedes waited on the tarmac, its windows tinted so dark she couldn't see inside. The driver didn't speak as he loaded her single suitcase into the trunk, didn't acknowledge her existence as he held open the rear door. Martha slid into leather seats that probably cost more than her entire year's salary and watched Seoul's glittering skyline grow closer through the windshield. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in Gangnam, the kind of building that looked like it had been carved from diamond and ambition. Martha's reflection stared back at her from every polished surface as she stepped inside, a girl in Target jeans and a thrift store cardigan, utterly out of place among marble columns and abstract sculptures that probably had their own insurance policies. "Your quarters," the driver said in accented English, gesturing to a suite of rooms that could have swallowed her entire Philadelphia apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Han River, the water black and serpentine under the city lights. A walk-in closet held designer clothes in her exact size, tags still attached. The bathroom featured a soaking tub deep enough to drown in and fixtures that looked like they belonged in a museum. She should have felt grateful. Lucky, even. Instead, she felt like an exhibit in someone else's collection. The surveillance cameras were discreet but unmistakable once you knew to look for them. One in each corner of the living room, angled to capture every inch of space. Another in the hallway, the kitchen, even the bedroom. Martha found herself performing ordinary tasks with unnatural precision, hyper-aware of the unseen eyes tracking her movements. Pouring coffee became a choreographed dance. Reading a book felt like a public performance. The first week passed in a haze of jet lag and surreal luxury. Staff appeared and disappeared like ghosts, leaving fresh towels and prepared meals without ever speaking to her directly. A personal shopper delivered more clothes. A hairstylist arrived unannounced to fix her appearance. Martha submitted to it all with numb compliance, signing receipts and nodding at instructions she barely understood. She wasn't allowed to leave. That much became clear on the third day when she approached the elevator and found it required a keycard she didn't possess. The emergency stairs were locked from the inside. Even the windows were sealed shut, the fresh air she craved trapped on the other side of bulletproof glass. "For your safety," the building manager explained in clipped English when she asked. "Mr. Kim's orders." Mr. Kim. She hadn't seen him since Philadelphia, though his presence saturated every corner of the penthouse. His taste in art, aggressive abstracts in blood red and shadow black. His choice of furniture, all sharp angles and cold metal. His surveillance, watching, always watching, even when he wasn't physically there. The late-night meetings started during her second week. Martha would wake to the murmur of voices drifting up from the floor below, masculine and urgent. She learned to recognize the rhythms of negotiation, the dangerous pauses that preceded raised voices. Once, she heard something that sounded like pleading, followed by a sound she tried very hard not to identify. "The problem has been handled," she heard Kim say one night, his voice carrying through the ventilation system with crystalline clarity. "Permanently." Martha pulled her blankets tighter and tried to unhear it. Tried to unknow what that word meant in the context of men who spoke in euphemisms and threats. Tried to forget the way Kim had looked at her in that Philadelphia office, calculating her worth like she was livestock at auction. During the day, she explored her gilded cage with increasing desperation. The penthouse library held books in 7 languages, none of which answered the questions screaming in her head. The kitchen was stocked with ingredients she didn't recognize and couldn't pronounce. The home gym featured equipment that looked like medieval torture devices reimagined in chrome and carbon fiber. She tried calling her mother once, using the phone she'd smuggled in her luggage. The line was dead. Not disconnected, actively blocked. When she checked, she found a new phone on her nightstand, sleek and expensive, with exactly 3 contacts programmed in. Building security. Medical services. Mr. Kim. The message was unmistakable. Her old life had been severed at the root. She stood at the window that night, watching Seoul pulse and shimmer below like a living thing. Somewhere in that sprawl of light and shadow, people were making choices. Going to dinner with friends. Kissing goodnight at doorways. Living lives that belonged entirely to them. Martha pressed her palm against the glass, feeling its unyielding cold. Outside was freedom. Inside was survival. And somewhere in that impossible distance between the two, she'd lost track of which one she'd actually chosen. The prenatal clinic smelled of antiseptic and artificial lavender, a combination that made Martha's stomach turn more than the morning sickness ever had. She sat in the waiting room, thumbing through a dog-eared parenting magazine from 2019, when the elevator doors opened and Sung Jae stepped out. He was in a navy suit that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe, phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapid Korean to someone who was clearly getting their ass handed to them. His eyes found hers across the room, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or was it panic? He ended the call mid-sentence. "What are you doing here?" Martha asked as he approached, hating how her voice sounded small in this sterile space. "I had a meeting nearby," he said, which was obviously bullshit. His office was in Gangnam, a solid 40 minutes away. "I thought I'd check in." Before she could call him on the lie, the nurse appeared. "Martha Bennett? We're ready for you." Sung Jae followed without asking permission, his presence filling the narrow hallway as they were led to the ultrasound room. The technician, a young woman with kind eyes and terrible timing, gestured to the examination table. Martha lay back, lifting her shirt to expose the small swell of her belly. The gel was cold, clinical, and she focused on the ceiling tiles to avoid looking at Sung-jae standing rigid in the corner like he was facing a firing squad. The technician moved the wand across Martha's skin, and the room filled with the watery sound of the baby's heartbeat, strong, steady, impossibly fast. Martha's own heart clenched. 5 months along, and it still didn't feel real. "There we are," the technician murmured, adjusting the screen. Then her expression changed, just slightly, a microscopic furrow between her brows that probably meant nothing, but in the cold logic of medical spaces always meant everything. She paused the wand. Checked something. Moved it again. "Is something wrong?" Martha's voice came out sharper than intended. "Just getting a better angle," the technician said, but her smile was practiced, professional. "The baby's positioned a bit awkwardly." Martha looked at Sung-jae then. His face had gone completely white, all the blood drained away like someone had opened a tap. He was staring at the monitor with an expression she'd never seen before, raw, unguarded terror. "I need to step out," he said abruptly. "Mr. Kim, we're almost." But he was already moving, yanking the door open with enough force to rattle the frame. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, rapid and uneven, like he was running from something only he could see. The technician looked at Martha with sympathy that felt worse than judgment. "First time, father?" Martha didn't correct her. She lay there as the examination continued. As the technician confirmed everything was fine, the baby was healthy, just positioned funny. She dressed in silence, took the ultrasound photos with numb fingers, and walked out into the waiting room expecting emptiness. Sung-jae was there. He stood by the window overlooking the street, one hand pressed flat against the glass, his shoulders rising and falling with breaths that looked like they hurt. When he heard her approach, he didn't turn around. "I had a sister," he said quietly. His reflection in the window looked like a ghost. "Minute Seo. She was 3 years younger than me." Martha stopped walking. The waiting room was empty except for them, the receptionist studiously pretending not to listen. "When I was 15, my mother got pregnant again. Surprise baby. My father was furious, it wasn't part of the plan, wasn't strategic." His laugh was bitter, scraping. "But my mother was happy. Minute Seo was happy. They talked about baby names, painted the nursery. I remember coming home from school and hearing them argue over whether yellow or green was more gender neutral." He finally turned to face her, and Martha saw that his eyes were dry but devastated, like he'd cried all his tears years ago and had nothing left. 20 weeks. That's when they found the heart defect. Hyperplastic left heart syndrome. The doctors used so many words I didn't understand, but I understood odds. I understood percentages. I understood when they stopped talking about treatment and started talking about comfort care. Martha's throat closed. She clutched the ultrasound photos against her chest. My sister was stillborn 3 months later. My mother held her for 6 hours before they finally convinced her to let go. His voice cracked, just slightly. She was perfect. Tiny and perfect and dead. The word hung between them like smoke. After that, my mother stopped painting. Stopped laughing. For 2 years, she was a shell. My father buried himself in work. And I learned that wanting something, loving something, doesn't protect it. Doesn't save it. Martha realized she was crying. "Sung-jae. This baby doesn't change anything," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. I can't do this. Can't watch it happen again." He walked past her toward the elevator, and this time Martha let him go. The ultrasound room was dim, the only light coming from the monitor where grainy images swirled in shades of gray and black. Yuna lay on the examination table, her shirt rolled up to expose the gentle curve of her belly, now unmistakably round at 20 weeks. Sung-jae stood beside her, his hand wrapped around hers, watching the technician's face more than the screen. He'd learned to read medical professionals over the years. The slight furrow of concentration was normal. The way they tilted their head, measuring things twice, was routine. But when the technician's movement slowed, when she lingered on one particular view for too long, when her lips pressed into a thin line, that's when the air in the room changed. "I need to get Dr. Kim," the technician said, her voice carefully neutral. Just want her to take a look at something. Yuna's hand tightened in his. What's wrong? I'm sure it's nothing, the technician said, but she was already out the door, moving faster than someone who was sure it was nothing. The 5 minutes they waited felt like hours. Sung-jae kept his breathing steady, kept his face calm, but inside his chest something was cracking. Not yet, he told himself. Not yet. Don't fall apart until you know. Dr. Kim entered with the practiced efficiency of someone who delivered difficult news before. She took the ultrasound wand without preamble, her eyes fixed on the monitor as she moved it across Yuna's belly. The baby appeared on screen, perfect tiny fingers, the curve of a spine, the rapid flutter of a heartbeat. That flutter. Sung-jae couldn't look away from it. The baby's heart rate is elevated, Dr. Kim said finally. And there's an irregularity in the 4-chamber view. It could be nothing, sometimes babies are just active, and the angle makes things look different than they are. But I want to be cautious. She turned to face them, her expression professional but kind. I'm referring you to a pediatric cardiologist. They'll do a fetal echocardiogram, a specialized ultrasound that looks specifically at the heart structure. Yuna's voice was small. What are you looking for? We want to rule out any congenital heart defects. The most common ones are things like septal defects, holes in the walls between chambers, or valve abnormalities. Many are minor and resolve on their own. Some require intervention after birth. Dr. Kim paused. I don't want you to panic. This is precautionary. But it's important we know what we're dealing with. The words hit Sung-jae like physical blows. Congenital heart defect. Intervention. The clinical terms he'd heard 16 years ago, sitting in a different hospital room, watching his mother process the same kind of news about Hannah. He was nodding, he realized. Asking the right questions. What were the next steps? When could they get the echocardiogram? What percentage of these cases turned out to be nothing? Dr. Kim answered patiently. 40% were false alarms. The specialized ultrasound could be scheduled within the week. They'd know more then. But Sung-jae had stopped listening. All he could see was Hannah at 4 years old, her tiny chest split open on an operating table. Hannah at 7, recovering from her second surgery. Hannah at 12, missing school for weeks because her body was rejecting the medication. Hannah at 15, lying in an ICU bed while machines kept her alive. Sung-jae? Yuna's voice cut through the memories. Did you hear that? He blinked. Dr. Kim was gone. They were alone in the dim room, and Yuna was sitting up, pulling her shirt down, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. We need to schedule the appointment, he said automatically. I know. She slid off the table, reaching for her bag. The receptionist is waiting for us. They walked through the motions together, made the appointment, accepted the information packet about fetal cardiology, smiled at the receptionist's reassurance that Dr. Park was the best in the city. The whole time, Sung-jae felt like he was moving through water, like reality had become something thick and resistant. In the car, neither of them spoke. Sung-jae gripped the steering wheel, staring at the parking garage's concrete wall. He should start the engine. He should say something comforting. He should be the stable one, the one who held everything together. It's going to be fine, Yuna said quietly. 40% chance it's nothing, remember? 60% chance it's something. The words came out harsher than he intended. Yuna flinched, and he hated himself for it. I'm sorry, he said immediately. I didn't mean. You're scared. Her voice was steady, but when he finally looked at her, there were tears on her cheeks. I'm scared too. But we don't know anything yet. But he did know. He knew how this story went. He'd lived it before, watched it destroy his family piece by piece. And now it was happening again, to the child he'd sworn to protect, the child who wasn't even born yet. Sung-jae started the car. The engine hummed to life, normal and mundane, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. As if his carefully constructed walls hadn't just developed their first fatal crack. The black SUV appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, idling at the corner where Martha always caught her bus after her morning shift at the diner. She noticed it because the windows were too dark, the engine too quiet, the way it crept forward as she approached too deliberate. Her hand tightened on her purse strap, and she walked past her usual stop, heart hammering against her ribs. The vehicle followed. She ducked into a convenience store, pretending to browse the aisles while watching through the window. The SUV waited. When the store clerk asked if she needed help, Martha's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Can I use your phone?" Sung Jae arrived in 7 minutes, which meant he'd broken every traffic law between his office and this neighborhood. He walked into that store like death wearing a tailored suit, and the tension in his shoulders told Martha everything she needed to know before he said a word. "Pack a bag," he said in the car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You're not going back to that apartment." Sung Jae. "Not negotiable." His voice cut like broken glass. "Kim's people have been watching you for 3 days. They know your schedule, your routes, every goddamn place you go." The compound sat behind walls that could repel a small army, cameras on every corner, guards who nodded at Sung Jae with the kind of respect born from fear and loyalty in equal measure. He led her to a suite of rooms that looked nothing like a prison despite feeling exactly like one. "You'll stay here," he said, already moving toward the door. "I have to." "Stop running." He froze, his back to her, every muscle rigid. "You brought me here because I'm in danger," Martha said quietly. "The least you can do is look at me." When he turned, his face was a stranger's. The Sung Jae she'd come to know, the one who ate her terrible coffee shop muffins and argued about poetry, had vanished behind the mask of a man who'd learned to weaponize his humanity. But his hands were shaking. "They were going to take you," he said, and the words sounded like they were being pulled from somewhere deep and bleeding. "Use you to get to me. Kim knows," he stopped, jaw working. "He knows exactly how to destroy me now. Because of your sister." The silence stretched so long Martha thought he might leave without answering. Instead, he sank onto the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. When he spoke, his voice belonged to someone much younger, someone who still remembered what it felt like to be helpless. "I was 17 when they took Ji-Hai. She was 14. His fingers dug into his scalp. "Our parents owed money to the wrong people. I was supposed to protect her. That was my job, protect my little sister while our father gambled away everything we had." Martha moved closer, slowly, like approaching something wounded. "They said if I worked for them, paid off the debt with my labor, they'd let her go. So I did everything they asked. Ran their errands, delivered their packages, broke the fingers of people who couldn't pay their own debts." His laugh was bitter, broken. "I told myself it was temporary. That once the debt was cleared, we'd be free. But they didn't let her go. They never intended to." He finally looked up, and Martha saw the 17-year-old boy swimming in his eyes, drowning in guilt that had calcified into something harder over the years. "By the time I found where they were keeping her, I was already too deep. Already one of them. I'd become exactly what they needed me to be. You saved her. I got her out. That's not the same thing." His hands clenched into fists. "She looks at me now and sees the monster they made. Her big brother who promised to protect her became the thing she needed protection from." Martha sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "And now Kim wants to do it again. Take someone you care about, use them as leverage, turn the screws until you break. I won't let him." The promise came out savage, absolute. "I've spent 15 years making sure I never cared about anyone enough to give them that power over me again. But you," he stopped, the admission clearly costing him. "You remind me what it felt like before. When I was still human enough to hope for something better." "You're still human, Sung Jae." "I'm really not." But his voice cracked on the words, betraying him. Martha reached for his hand, felt it trembling in hers. The monster wouldn't be afraid right now. The monster wouldn't have noticed that SUV following me. Wouldn't have gotten here in 7 minutes. Wouldn't be sitting here explaining why he has to keep me safe. He looked at their joined hands like he was seeing something impossible. "Your sister was wrong," Martha said softly. "You didn't become the thing she needed protection from. You became the thing standing between her and everything worse." The contractions started 3 weeks early, sharp and insistent, pulling Martha from sleep at 2 a.m. with a gasp that had her clutching the silk sheets. Sung-jae was awake instantly, his hand finding hers in the darkness, steady and warm despite the alarm flashing across his features. "It's too early," Martha whispered, fear threading through her voice as another wave of pain rolled through her abdomen. "She's not supposed to come yet. We're going now." His voice carried absolute certainty as he helped her from the bed, already reaching for his phone with his free hand. By the time they descended to the waiting car, the entire private wing of Seoul Medical Center had been activated, doctors roused from sleep, equipment prepped, a sterile suite prepared with military efficiency. The hospital looked different at night, its fluorescent corridors emptier but somehow more clinical, more real. Martha gripped Sung-jae's arm as they moved through hallways that seemed to telescope endlessly before them, each contraction stealing her breath and leaving her trembling. She'd read about this moment in books, watched it dramatized in films, but nothing had prepared her for the raw animal terror of her body moving beyond her control, forcing this tiny life into a world that suddenly felt impossibly dangerous. The private wing existed in a bubble of privilege and power, no waiting rooms, no shared spaces, just immaculate suites that resembled luxury hotel rooms more than medical facilities. Sung-jae had arranged everything months ago, though neither of them had expected to need it this soon. Martha caught glimpses of unfamiliar faces as nurses moved efficiently around her. Was that woman really medical staff, or another of his people? The question flickered and died as pain consumed everything else. He never left her side. Through the long hours that followed, as her body worked to deliver their daughter into the world, Sung-jae remained a constant presence. His hand held hers through every contraction, his voice low and steady in her ear when the pain grew overwhelming, his touch gentle against her sweat-dampened forehead. She'd expected him to maintain that controlled distance he showed the rest of the world, but here in this raw moment, she saw something different. Genuine fear flickering behind his composed exterior, tenderness in the way he murmured reassurances she barely heard through the roaring in her ears. The obstetrician spoke in calm, measured tones that Martha's fractured attention struggled to follow. Everything was progressing normally, she said, despite the early timing. The baby's heartbeat remained strong. Just a little longer now. Martha clung to those words even as her body felt like it was splitting apart, even as exhaustion threatened to pull her under. Then suddenly there was pressure and release and a sound, weak, barely more than a mew, that made Martha's heart clench with desperate longing. She tried to see, straining against the hands gently pressing her back, catching only a glimpse of something impossibly tiny and pale before white coats surrounded the table. "Let me see her," Martha gasped, reaching out with trembling hands. "Please, I need to." But the medical team had already shifted into swift, coordinated motion that sent ice flooding through her veins. Their voices remained professional, carefully controlled, but she could hear the urgency underneath. Irregular heartbeat. NICU. Respiratory support. The words crashed over her like breaking waves, each one stealing more of her breath. "Sung-jae?" Her voice cracked as she searched for him in the sudden chaos, needing his solidity, his certainty that everything could be controlled and managed. He was there instantly, his face carved from stone but his hand gripping hers with desperate intensity. "They are taking care of her," he said, and she heard what he wouldn't say aloud, that even his power, his resources, his carefully constructed empire meant nothing in this moment. Their daughter's life hung in a balance he couldn't manipulate. Martha watched through tears as they wheeled the incubator past, catching only the briefest glimpse of their child, so small she looked more doll than human, her skin nearly translucent, her tiny chest rising and falling in an irregular rhythm that made Martha's own heart stutter in sympathy. She wanted to scream, to demand they bring her baby back, but her body felt hollowed out and useless, capable only of producing ragged sobs. "Go with her," Martha whispered, though every cell in her body rebelled against letting him leave. "Don't let her be alone." For a moment Sung-jae's composure cracked completely, raw anguish flashing across his features. Then he pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture so tender it broke something in her chest. "I'll bring her back to you," he promised, his voice rough with emotion she'd never heard from him before. "I swear it." Then he was gone, following the medical team through doors that swung shut with devastating finality, and Martha was left alone in the too quiet room, her arms empty, her daughter fighting for life in a sterile unit where all her mother's love meant nothing against failing biology. Sungjae's hands trembled as he slipped them through the sterile ports of the incubator, his fingers barely able to reach his daughter's tiny body. The warmth of her skin against his palm felt like both a lifeline and a condemnation. She was so small, so impossibly fragile, with tubes and wires connecting her to machines that beeped and hummed in a rhythm that made his chest constrict. The monitors glowed in the dim light of the NICU, displaying numbers and graphs he'd learned to read over the past 72 hours. Heart rate, oxygen saturation, blood pressure. Each fluctuation sent his own heart racing, each alarm made his breath catch in his throat. He'd spent 3 days staring at these screens, watching them the way other fathers might watch their children play in a park, desperate for any sign that things were improving. But tonight was different. Tonight, as he touched his daughter's chest and felt the rapid flutter of her heartbeat beneath his fingertips, something inside him finally cracked. The monitors looked exactly like the ones from 23 years ago. The same green lines tracing peaks and valleys. The same electronic beeps that had become the soundtrack of his nightmares. The same sterile smell of antiseptic and fear that he tried so hard to forget. He'd been 7 years old, standing in a hospital room not so different from this one, watching his baby sister fight for every breath. Sujin had been born too early, just like his daughter. The doctors had used the same careful words, the same gentle tones that meant everything and nothing at the same time. His parents had stood vigil just as he was doing now, their faces etched with the same desperate hope that he saw in Martha's eyes every time she looked at their child. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Sujin's tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb. Her impossibly small face, peaceful in sleep. The way his mother had sung to her in Korean, soft lullabies that promised a future that would never come. The morning his father had come to his room with tears streaming down his face, unable to speak, unable to do anything but hold his son while the world fell apart around them. Sungjae's shoulders began to shake. He tried to hold it back, tried to maintain the composure that had carried him through law school, through building his empire, through every calculated move he'd made in his carefully constructed life. But the dam had finally broken, and there was no stopping the flood. A sob tore from his throat, raw and animal-like. His daughter stirred slightly at the sound, and that only made it worse. He was crying for her, for this perfect little being who might not make it through the week. He was crying for Sujin, for the sister he'd lost and never properly mourned because he'd been too young to understand, too scared to feel. He was crying for the 7-year-old boy who'd learned that love meant loss, that caring meant suffering, that the safest thing to do was to never let anyone close enough to hurt you again. The sobs came harder now, shaking his entire body. 23 years of grief poured out of him in waves, each one more devastating than the last. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He could only feel the crushing weight of all the emotion he'd buried, all the pain he'd transformed into ambition and control, and the relentless pursuit of success that meant he'd never have to feel vulnerable again. He didn't hear Martha enter the room. Didn't notice her presence until he felt her hand on his shoulder, gentle but steady. He turned to look at her through his tears, and what he saw in her face destroyed him all over again. There was no judgment there. No fear or disgust at seeing him broken. Just understanding, and a pain that matched his own, and something else, something that looked terrifyingly like forgiveness. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words barely coherent between sobs. "I'm so sorry. I can't lose her. I can't lose another." His voice broke completely, and he couldn't finish the sentence. Martha's arms came around him then, pulling him away from the incubator and into an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. He collapsed against her, this woman he'd used and manipulated and tried so hard not to love, and let himself fall completely apart. She held him while he cried for both daughters, the one he'd lost and the one he might lose. She held him while he finally grieved for the childhood that had ended the day Sujin died, for the walls he'd built so high that he'd forgotten there was a world outside them. She held him without speaking, because there were no words that could make this better, no promises that could guarantee their daughter would survive. The contract lay on the table behind them, its crisp legal language suddenly meaningless. All the clauses and conditions and carefully worded terms couldn't protect him from this. Nothing could. Love was the risk he'd spent his entire adult life trying to avoid, and here he was, drowning in it, destroyed by it, and somehow, impossibly, saved by it all at once. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor cast harsh shadows across Sungjae's face as he stood outside the NICU, watching through the glass as nurses moved around his daughter's incubator. She was so small, her tiny chest rising and falling with the help of machines, her perfect little fingers curled into fists no bigger than walnuts. The surgery had been successful, they said. She would live. But the terror of those hours when her life hung in the balance had shattered something fundamental inside him. His hand trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded contract. The paper felt heavy, weighted with all the cruelty he'd convinced himself was necessary. $10 million to make Martha disappear. To erase her from his life like she'd never existed. To raise his daughter alone in the gilded cage of his world, surrounded by violence and power and the constant calculation of survival. He'd been a fool. Sungjae unfolded the contract slowly, his eyes scanning the cold legal language that reduced love to clauses and conditions. Every word was a knife he'd aimed at Martha's heart. Every clause was proof that he'd learned nothing from his father except how to wound the people who dared to care about him. His vision blurred, and he realized with shock that tears were streaming down his face. When was the last time he'd cried? Not at his mother's funeral. Not when his father had beaten him unconscious at 15 for showing mercy to a debtor. Not through decades of blood and betrayal. But here, in this sterile hospital corridor, watching his newborn daughter fight for every breath, Sungjae Kim finally broke. He tore the contract in half. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet hallway. He tore it again and again, until the pieces were too small to tear anymore. They fluttered from his hands like snow, settling on the polished floor around his expensive Italian shoes. $10 million in confetti. A fortune in scraps of paper that meant nothing compared to the woman sleeping exhausted in the recovery room down the hall. "Sir." One of his men approached cautiously, eyes widening at the sight of the destroyed contract. "Is everything?" "Find Martha," Sungjae said, his voice rough. "Make sure she has everything she needs. Run the clock protection. No one gets within 50 feet of her or the baby without my explicit approval." "Yes, sir." "And the contract?" Sungjae looked at the scattered pieces on the floor. "There is no contract. There never was. Martha stays. She's family now." The man's eyebrows rose fractionally, but he was too well trained to question his boss. He simply nodded and walked away, already pulling out his phone to relay the orders. Sungjae turned back to the window, watching his daughter sleep. She looked so peaceful now, unaware of the war raging around her, the empire built on violence that bore her name as its heir. That empire would destroy her. Just like it had destroyed him. His phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at the screen and saw messages piling up from his lieutenants. Rival families were already sensing vulnerability, circling like sharks. His absence from the office, the distraction of the birth, weakness was blood in the water in his world. They would come for him. They would come for his family. Unless he struck first, unless he maintained the iron grip that had kept him alive for 20 years. But what kind of life was that for his daughter? Growing up surrounded by armed guards and armored cars, learning to trust no one, watching her father's hands stained with blood he could never quite wash clean? What kind of life was that for Martha, jumping at shadows, wondering which business associate might be the one to finally put a bullet in Sungjae's head? He'd built his empire on the foundation of his father's brutality, convinced himself that power was the only thing that mattered. But his father had died alone in that mansion, murdered by the very organization he'd given his life to control. And Sungjae was walking the exact same path. Unless he chose differently. The idea formed slowly, almost too radical to comprehend. What if he just walked away? Liquidated the legitimate holdings, transferred the rest to his lieutenants, and disappeared with Martha and the baby? His father would have called it cowardice. His associates would call it suicide. Leaving the organization meant painting a target on his back that would never fade. But staying meant painting that same target on his daughter. On Martha. Sungjae pulled out his phone and opened his encrypted contacts. He scrolled past dozens of names of men who would kill for him or die for him, until he found the one he needed. Park Jin-woo, his oldest friend, the only person in the organization who might understand. He typed slowly, "I need to discuss my exit strategy. Tomorrow. Come alone." The response came within seconds, "Are you sure?" Sung-jae looked through the glass at his daughter, then thought of Martha recovering down the hall. For the first time in his life, he was absolutely certain. Yes. I'm choosing them. But can a man like Sung-jae Kim truly escape the empire he built on blood and power? Will his enemies allow him to walk away, or will his choice to protect his family make them even bigger targets? Like and subscribe for more of Martha and Sung-jae's story. See you in the next video.